and I'm Shannon McClellan. I'm the Industrial Stormwater General Permit Writer here at Department of Ecology headquarters. I started about 6 months ago, and before that I was with Tennessee Department of Environmental Conservation as an individual NPDES permit writer. And I've been in water quality, water resources protection my entire career. So um, it's been my pride and joy, and I'll let John introduce himself too.
Hi, folks. My name's John Bhend. I'm the statewide UIC coordinator, underground injection control. I've been in the position for just over 1 year now. Prior to that, I worked as an environmental consultant for over 25 years, doing anything from phase 1, phase 2 assessments, remediation work, and then also some stormwater permitting work for construction stormwater general permits. So with that, I guess I'll kick it back to Shannon.
All right, so today's discussion is going to be about the discharge to ground language. That's an industrial stormwater general permit that we reissued and is effective January 1st of 2025. The discharge to ground language has some language regarding functional equivalency and PFAS sampling. So this is going to go into further depth about those updates in the language of the permit. And so it's for those who aren't familiar, I'll discuss some of those changes and have a focus on who needs to sample, how, and when it qualifies. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to Brandon, or Jeff, or John regarding discharges to ground language in the ISGP, or John, especially in the UIC unit, if you have questions related to the UIC wells. So we added a definition in the permit regarding discharge, groundwater discharge point, and that's just to further clarify what that is. And we have more information about these discharges, like locations and type of infiltration. So rolling back a little bit, even though the permit is categorically triggered when facilities discharge stormwater to surface water, once a facility has the permit, permit holders are also required to manage stormwater discharged into groundwater. For example, when stormwater is directed to on-site infiltrations like UIC wells or bioretention structures, those that discharge to ground only and do not discharge to surface water do not need ISGP coverage, but ecology can pull any facility under the permit on a case-by-case basis, such as a significant contributor of pollutant determination, and we can do this under special condition G12. That gives us the authority to do so. The 2025 permit, like I said, included that new definition of groundwater discharge point. And what that means is the location where stormwater associated with industrial activity enters a stormwater infiltration structure that is used, intended, or designed to infiltrate water into the ground. So then we're also having those groundwater discharge points added to your SWIP maps, your SWIP site maps, to provide more information regarding the locations where they discharge to ground and the type of infiltration structure. And facilities that discharge to ground through infiltration, class 5 underground injection control or UIC wells, etc., must have all treatment and infiltration BMPs designed, installed, and maintained following the permit conditions. So I'll go next. So this is the language for the permit is condition S1E discharges to ground. The permittee is not required to sample on-site discharges to ground unless they meet these 3 requirements. The facility is subject to per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS or PFOS, per condition S5B in the permit. 2 is specifically required by ecology on that case-by-case basis under special condition G12, such as a SCOP, a significant contributor of pollutant determination, or 3, a discharge point to groundwater is deemed by ecology to constitute a functional equivalent to a point source discharge to surface waters. So an example would be, say, an auto recycler discharges all to ground, but that discharge to ground directly discharges to a water body or surface water like a point source discharge. what they think is a groundwater discharge is actually a surface water discharge. And we'll get more into that of how that is exactly considered. So what triggers this, of course, and so in that point one of it, the facility being subject to PFAS sampling, that is for PFAS sampling is now required for waste management facilities such as landfills, recyclers, etc., and airports that have currently known or known historical current or sorry known or unknown historical or current use of AFFF, which is the aqueous film forming foam, which is firefighting foams. This is a protectant that was the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, requires just for safety in case there's a fire of some sort. And of course, these AFFs, the triple forming foams, have PFAS in them. And so those activities run off and get in contact with stormwater and they're discharged to ground. There's a lot of groundwater contamination from like federal facilities or military bases and stuff like that that use like those practice type things, and they have like a pond that captured all of it and it just all went into the ground back in the day. So ecology determined that the two sectors for waste management and airports have the potential for PFAS exposure and stormwater contamination. In the case of waste management facilities, since I discussed a little bit on airports and things, there's a potential that the facilities in waste management receive PFAS through past or ongoing waste management activity that may increase PFAS concentrations in stormwater discharges. The permit requires quarterly sampling of PFAS of stormwater discharges using EPA method 1633, including those which are discharged or infiltrated to groundwater, again, via UAC well, infiltration, BMP, etc. It's report only at this time, and those are in effect now. And you can see those in your DMRs and those monitoring summary letters that Ecology is sending out to the permittees. So why are we doing this? The reason we're doing this is allowing Ecology to characterize PFAS and stormwater discharges from these sectors, assess the effectiveness of BMPs and best management practices, and other permit requirements to reduce PFAS, and it may also help identify certain discharges and or sites for further investigation and or corrective action. So yeah. So these are based off the Groundwater Protection WAC 173-200. And in the WAC, water quality standards for groundwaters of the state of Washington fall under this ruling code. And in that code, it specifically states that all groundwater in Washington state is classified as a potential source of drinking water. And this is also in section 1.1 of the implementation guidance for the groundwater quality standards publication. Okay, so getting into the fun stuff of functional equivalent, what is a functional equivalent discharge? So a functional equivalent to a point source discharge to surface water. If a site has a functional equivalent to a point source discharge to surface water, they need ISGP coverage. And this is based off of the Supreme Court ruling of County of Maui versus Hawaii Wildlife Fund court decision. A functional equivalent discharge to surface water is when sampling of assigned benchmarks is required, and a functional equivalent is an ecology determination. And so I'll get into what is County of Maui versus Hawaii Wildlife Fund court decision. I'm not going to get into the whole nitty-gritty details, but the general overall summary of this court case is that it's a court case regarding a wastewater plant in Hawaii directly discharging its wastewater into ground via class 5 injection wells. The discharge resulted in being point source discharge to surface water or the ocean due to the lava tubes that they were injecting into that they probably didn't know of. and the geology of the area that was transporting the wastewater directly into the ocean without dilution or natural attenuation. So this has to do with time and distance transport as well as, like I said, it wasn't getting diluted. It wasn't being absorbed or filtered out through natural processes of sand, gravel, clays, etc. It was just a class 5 well directly injected into a lava tube, which then shot out with no dilution whatsoever into the ocean. So not very good for the wildlife in our oceans. Um, so in this case, the Supreme Court held that point source discharges to a water of the United States through groundwater requires an NPDES, or a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit, if the discharge is the functional equivalent of a direct discharge. And you can kind of see in this photo, which gives a really nice little visual from Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer, that they did a dye tracing test. Dye tracing test is really cheap and it's super effective at figuring out where water is going. A lot of it's also used for like caves and aquifer systems and figuring out springs and things like that. It's used a lot in the southeast. So you can see in this photo the dye that's pluming out. It's very bright green, and that's due to the limestone geology in that area and how it's doing. It's just directly discharging into an aquifer, like figuring out the aquifer and it discharging, pluming out into this major water body. So this is kind of a good picture of what we're talking about, of a functional equivalent point source discharge to surface water. Okay, so here's going to be another example. So another example is going to be a UIC well, or an underground injection control well, that is located 20 feet from the bank of a major river or water body, is a likely source of a functional equivalent to a point source discharge to surface water. Um, And here's the EPA website. I submitted this to Brandon, I believe, in a post Q&A document, but also in an email. And it's a really great link for a bunch of frequently asked questions regarding this topic. Has hydrologic guidance? How do you do the determinations? Obviously, ecology is doing the determinations, but it just has a lot of really useful things and goes into further depth about this court case decision and how, in plain language, what's a functional equivalent, how to sample, all that fun stuff. So, and I can have that link dropped into the chat later on. Okay, so we're going to get into some of these frequently asked questions that I found really useful on the EPA website. So the first question is, must the discharge be from a point source? And EPA responded, yes. A discharge of pollutants must be from a point source to waters of the United States to require NPDES permit authorization. In Maui, the Supreme Court held that NPDES authorization is, sorry, I need to move my screen here, is required for certain discharges of pollutants from point sources that travel through groundwater to surface waters and wetlands that are waters of the United States. Okay, a couple other questions. Are all releases of pollutants from a point source through groundwater to waters of the United States the functional equivalent of direct discharge? No. Some releases from a point source through groundwater to water of the state waters of the United States require an NPDES permit, and some do not. Specifically, only discharges through groundwater that are the functional equivalent of a direct discharge require an NPDES permit. Again, this is more of like that time and distance thing. And if you go to that website of the EPA and PDS discharge link that I have in there, it goes into further explanation of what the court was looking into for factors of what a functional equivalent discharge to surface water looks like. And there's another example here. Oh, please tell me I didn't just advance 2 slides. I did not. Okay, perfect. Is the functional equivalent of a direct discharge determination site specific? Yes, this is a site case-by-case basis. Whether a release from a point source that travels through groundwater before discharging to a water of the United States is the functional equivalent of a direct discharge depends on the site-specific features. It's going to be a lot on your soil lithology, right? Like if you have sticky clays and sands and gravels and silts and all that jazz. If you have some tight clays and some sands and silts, your time and distance is going to be greatly reduced because your water is not shooting through like a lava tube, for instance. Which factors did the court identify as most important in most cases is transit time and distance traveled. Again, just thinking about that dye tracing test that's going through limestone or a lava tube, for instance, and is shooting directly into a surface water of the state. So hopefully this clarifies a little bit more of what we're looking at, of what the heck a functional equivalent discharge to surface water looks like. Okay, sampling discharges to ground. I know we've been getting a lot of questions on this, and I'm still currently working on updating that stormwater sampling manual, but this is some language that is coming from that, that I work with John and a couple of our hydrogeologists here. So sampling discharges to ground. A UIC well or engineered system that is a functional equivalent discharge to surface water must be sampled for all of the assigned parameters. Again, functional equivalent, keyword. If a permittee is required to sample for PFAS, they must sample any stormwater discharges to ground. The sampling may be conducted where industrial stormwater is discharged into the stormwater infiltration structure. So we've had questions. Can I sample after my infiltration BMPs? Yes, you can. And there are some ways that you can do that. So for the last bullet, the sampling may be conducted where industrial stormwater is discharged into the stormwater infiltration structure. For example, in the catch basin, you can sample in the catch basin that drains into a UIC well. You can sample after your infiltration BMPs to capture that treatment. And we will go further into that. Uh-oh, there we go. Okay, perfect. So this is a picture of a piezometer, which is super duper useful. A lot of the times it's used for pore water, but it's also used for doing like these shallow type surface sampling that we're wanting to capture that sample, representative sample, before it hits groundwater, before it gets into the diluted portion. So a permittee may sample stormwater runoff after infiltration treatment, like a bio infiltration or a bioswale, things like that. You can do that via a piezometer, like this shown here, or a lysometer installed through or immediately down gradient of an infiltration BMP. So you can grab the sucker, shove it straight down into the bioinfiltration BMP, get into that vadose zone that's saturated, and start collecting that water for PFAS. Because PFAS doesn't really absorb or degrade or whatnot. But if you have some like biochar mixes, or maybe there's some carbon, it might absorb a little bit and filter that out. But for the most part, PFAS, as we know, is pretty indestructible. So the screen of the piezometer or well can be installed in the vadose zone prior to the treated stormwater reaching the groundwater table. And samples may be collected using a peristaltic pump or other low flow sampling equipment. For PFAS sampling, I had to do this a lot when my time in Alabama and 3M. I was in remediation as a consultant doing a lot of CERCLA and Superfund sites for PFAS sampling. So just giving my little I have experience, you guys, I promise. So for PFAS sampling, you have to use the use of HDPE tubing, and non-Teflon sampling materials and equipment is required because it's super tricky. Those detection values in the lab are very, very low for PFAS. And so you have to be very careful and make sure you're using HDPE tubing and non-Teflon. Okay. And this, yeah, it's a little schematic, just kind of shows here's your little peristaltic pump and your HDPE tubing and the pore water going into that screen length and all that fun stuff, which is a good picture. Okay. Sampling discharge to ground continued. So a piezometer or lysometer should be screened within the vadose zone and immediately below the BMP to be representative of the treated stormwater, again, discharge before discharging to groundwater. The piezometers, and that should not say shallow monitoring wells, that should say lysometers, must meet minimum construction and installation requirements per WAC 173, 164, 51, which John will go into more detail. And This rule requires a surface seal with bentonite to prevent potential contamination from the surface migrating downward. So if you think about it, say you have a site that has historical contamination. Maybe it was a surplus site and it got capped. You want to bentonite that seal. You really want to seal that off so you're not shoving your contaminants deeper down to where you really don't want them to be going. Just as a precaution. So an example for where you would put your piezometer is, so if a BMP such as a bioretention basin or a bioswale is 10 feet deep, the piezometer lysometer should be placed 11 to 12 feet deep to capture a representative sample. Okay, and I will hand this off to John, and John will let me know when to advance slides.
Oh, thank you, Shannon. So now the portion of the presentation is going to talk about UIC wells, rules, permit requirements, and examples. And Shannon, you can move on. So the underground injection control program, that is UIC rule WAC 173218. The UIC program guidelines for stormwater discharge to UIC wells has been incorporated in the stormwater management manuals for the state. For Western Washington, it's in volume 1 or volume I-4. And for the ones for Eastern Washington, it's in chapter 5 of the SWIM. And you might want to understand kind of what is a UIC well. A UIC well can be one of the general different types. It can be a bored, drilled, or a driven shaft or a dug hole whose depth is greater than the largest surface dimension. And also it can be an excavated hole whose depth is greater than the largest surface dimension. So to be either of those two, you got to be pretty specific. It's not going to be like a stormwater pond or infiltration basin because of the depth being less than the greatest diameter. It also can be an improved sinkhole. And the first three are really kind of uncommon, not very readily used for stormwater management. The fourth type is a subsurface fluid distribution system, which includes perforated pipes, drain tiles, or other similar mechanisms intended to distribute fluids below the ground surface. These are more commonly used in for stormwater infiltration across the state. And kind of going into a little more detail, I want to talk about some examples of UIC wells that are used, that are termed Class 5 UIC wells. And Class 5 wells are usually shallow injection wells that inject fluids above the uppermost groundwater aquifer. Some specific examples include dry wells, drain fields, infiltration trenches that have a perforated pipe, storm chamber systems with the intent to infiltrate. You see a lot of these appearing more often on larger acreage, larger size properties. We've got large buildings and parking lots, and they can put them under the parking lot areas to maximize the buildable area. Then also French drains designed in part to discharge surface water into the ground, and also bioretention systems intending to infiltrate water from a perforated pipe below the treatment zone. And this slide shows some pictures or images of different types of Class 5 UIC wells. As I said before, they're man-made structures deeper than the largest surface dimension, or contains perforated pipe. That's kind of a good general description. So over on the left, you've got a cross-section diagram of a dry well. Top center, you've got a typical dry well awaiting to be put into the ground. The upper right image is of an infiltration trench that includes perforated pipe. And down on the bottom right, you have an example of a storm chamber system. Now, I want to also mention that these Class 5 UIC wells that once used to manage stormwater, most of them are less than 20 feet deep. On occasion, you have some that are termed deep UIC wells, and those are the ones that penetrate the upper low permeable soils, glacial till, and discharge to deeper aquifers. Typically in Western Washington, it's the outwash deposit aquifers that are below the till. Next slide. And I want to go over some examples that are not UIC wells. Buried pipe and or tile networks that serve to collect water and discharge that water to a conveyance system and to surface water. Surface infiltration ponds and flow dispersion stormwater facilities. These don't contain perforated pipes, and their diameter is greater than their depth, so they won't be classified as a UIC well from that perspective. Other examples that are not are infiltration trenches that do not contain perforated pipe or a similar mechanism. And also permeable pavement. This could be porous asphalt, pervious concrete, permeable interlocking pavement, and aggregate pavers are not classified as UIC wells. And for UIC wells to be rule authorized, the fluids being discharged from the wells needs to meet the non-endangerment standard. And to meet the non-endangerment standards, it means that the fluids cannot contain contaminant levels that would cause an exceedance of the groundwater quality standards. And there's two different approaches that one can go to design their wells to meet the non-endangerment standard. One is the presumptive approach. And this requires implementation of the associated best management practices, BMPs, in the stormwater manuals or SWIMs, or an equivalent manual adopted at the time of construction. The other way is to do the demonstrative approach. And this must show with UIC specific emphasis how the proposed runoff treatment BMPs will be protective of the groundwater quality and meet the non-endangerment standard. And when we're looking at proponents doing the demonstrative approach, the criteria are specified in the stormwater manuals. And basically, we want you to look at a site-specific analysis of pollutant loading, including a risk assessment of down gradient in adjacent drinking water sources. We want proponents to look at site-specific analysis of the treatment zone capacity of the vadose zone, if that's going to be used for treatment. We want a BMP selection process used to be described. Also, we want the pollutant removal expected from the BMPs to be described. The technical support documenting the performance of the selected BMPs, and an assessment of how the selected BMPs will comply with state groundwater quality standards and satisfy the all known, available, reasonable methods of prevention, control, and treatment, otherwise known as ACART, requirements. And I have to say that the majority of UIC registrants use the presumptive approach when designing their UIC wells, as the demonstrative approach requires a lot of site-specific data and potentially even some on-site monitoring requirements. So that's not used as frequently. And some of the UIC, general well requirements. The UIC wells must either be rural authorized or covered by a state waste discharge permit or a waste discharge general permit. It also requires registration of the wells with the Ecology's UIC program. The discharge from the UIC well must meet the non-endangerment standard. It can't cause exceedance of the groundwater quality criteria. There's also some prohibitions on siting of UIC wells with respect to prohibited areas for rural authorization. These areas and restrictions and prohibitions are discussed in volume 1-4.12 of the SWIM for Western Washington and chapter 5.12 of the SWIM for Eastern Washington. And some of these kind of prohibitions, they might be on properties that are where vehicle maintenance, repair, and service activities are being completed, commercial or fleet vehicle washing, airport facilities, in general, industrial properties that might have outdoor storage of different types of products that could leach contaminants into the stormwater runoff. And also, there's also for UIC rule authorization requirements, there's a minimum vertical separation distance required between the bottom of the UIC well and the seasonal high groundwater level. Typically, we're looking at a minimum of 5 feet of separation distance, and that can be reduced to as little as 3 feet if project proponents will do a groundwater mounting analysis to demonstrate that during heavy rainfall, the groundwater level is not going to mound into the UIC, which would result in a potential direct discharge of stormwater to groundwater, which in those circumstances, the UIC wells can't be roll authorized. We'd be asking proponents to either redesign or retrofit their systems to get more separation distance, or look into getting a state waste discharge permit or a waste discharge general permit. And that kind of concludes my portion of the presentation, and we'll open it up to questions from folks.
I want to thank Shannon, John, the rest of Ecology's crew for participating in our presentation today. We did turn the cameras off for the Q&A session, but we were able to write down the questions and we're going to present them to you anonymously. Some of the questions we didn't have time to get to, so we wrote down all the questions that were asked, sent them on to Ecology, and they have responded to us. So let's go ahead and get into it. So the first question is Ecology putting out a guidance document on sampling methodology for PFAS for discharges to ground, for things like ensuring sample integrity, clothing of the sampler, etc. Ecology responded that they for now recommend using the ITRC and Michigan DEQ PFAS sampling documents for PFAS sampling and sampling integrity, and that Ecology is updating and preparing to republish the ISGP sampling manual for where and how to sample for discharges to ground and PFAS. The next question says, it sounds like foundation drains do not qualify as a UIC, but some French drains could depending on how they discharge. Ecology responded that foundation drains are not classified as UIC well. A French drain that is designed in part to discharge surface water into the ground is classified as a UIC well. The next question is, if a recycling facility has several different discharge locations that discharge to separate bioswales that frequently do not discharge to surface water, and one of those discharge locations / bioswales only handles packaged food waste for depacking, could this discharge point be exempted from PFAS testing? Ecology's response here is that waste management and remediation services with the NAICS code 562 including but not limited to landfills, transfer stations, open dumps, and land application sites, except as described in S1, C6, C7, or C9, are subject to PFAS requirements as stated in S5, Table 3 of the ISGP. Materials recycling facilities, or MRFs, fall under NAICS 562 and are required to sample for PFAS. However, the other types of recycling facilities that require ISGP coverage, including NAICS 42314 and 42393, such as metal scrapyards, auto recyclers, etc., are not subject to PFAS sampling. The next question asks, if we use perforated pipes for conveyance, would that be a UIC? Perforated pipes can be used to collect water and convey away from an area and not be intended to be used for infiltration. Ecology's response is that that type of system would not require registration as a UIC if the intent is to convey stormwater to a location rather than groundwater via infiltration. Moving on, if we discharge industrial stormwater solely through an infiltration pond in a sole source aquifer recharge area, would that require a permit? Or since this is 100% infiltration, would no permit be required? Ecology's response is that a site that discharges solely to groundwater, including an infiltration scenario within a sole source aquifer recharge area, is categorically exempt from needing coverage under the ISGP, except in the rare cases of such an on-site infiltration discharge being the functional equivalent to a point source discharge to surface waters. Ecology does have authority to require site-specific ISGP coverage under condition S1B on a case-by-case basis. If Ecology finds the facility a significant contributor of pollutants and or the discharge is a functional equivalent, then we would require the facility to gain ISGP coverage per condition S1B. The next question is, if a stormwater basin is already associated with a surface water discharge, does it also need a ground discharge sample if we're required to sample for PFAS? For example, water that flows through a bioswale and may or may not discharge to surface water depending on the amount of precipitation. Ecology's response is yes, you are required to sample surface water and discharges to ground for PFAS. PFAS sampling is required at designated engineered groundwater discharge points, even if some of that stormwater from the drainage area also discharges to surface waters in certain circumstances. Please see the definition in the permit. A groundwater discharge point means the location where stormwater associated with industrial activity enters a stormwater infiltration structure that is used, intended, or designed to infiltrate water into the ground. Sampling surface water and the discharges to groundwater follows the requirements of the permit to meet both waste discharge permit and NPDES permits, water quality standards. The next question is, would ponding or a puddle at a facility that may infiltrate need to sample? This was asked in terms of functionally equivalent discharges to surface water and the PFAS sampling requirements. Ecology's response is that no, a puddle at a facility does not require sampling. It would not meet the definition of a groundwater discharge point. Again, that means the location where stormwater associated with industrial activity enters a stormwater infiltration structure that's used, intended, or designed to infiltrate water into the ground. The next question is, would the piezometer/sampling option that Shannon mentioned be considered a UIC because it's a hole deeper than its largest surface dimension? Ecology responded that no, it would be a sampler and not a UIC well. The next question is, what would the mechanism that Ecology would use to determine the groundwater discharge was a functional equivalent discharge to surface water look like? Ecology responded that they would use the guidance located in the EPA NPDES website, site-specific factors, and inspections as needed to determine the functional equivalency. Moving on, what due diligence would an air transportation facility need to go through to determine that there's no known historical use of AFFF and that it wouldn't need to sample PFAS? Ecology responded that air transportation facilities that have ISGP coverage are required to sample for PFAS if they've had known historical use of AFFF at the facility. The permittee is responsible for the depth and breadth of the site-specific assessment, which may include a review of things like site historical documents, historical and current emergency training activities, emergency system flushings, and other sources of information. The next question is, if an air transportation facility has no known use of AFFF and doesn't need to sample, how do they mark that on their DMR or get that removed from their DMR? Ecology responded that if a facility truly doesn't have known use of AFFF, the permittee may use the qualifier code M. Monitoring is conditional / not required at this monitoring report. on their quarterly DMRs. So that was all of the questions that came up during this session. If you have other questions or concerns, reach out to the Stormwater Center and visit our website at wastormwatercenter.org.